It's the only way to fix it. So let's just take a minute and just let's let that settle, because it really does make sense, right?
And that's the highest standard.
It's the highest standard, and almost nothing passes it, because it's really hard. So like I always like to think of in my mind like a situation that would pass it. So like something that would pass it is if there were a country out there that somehow medically we were able to figure out that everyone from just that one country had some kind of very serious disease that was a transmissible disease. And it was only people from that country, and the only way of knowing if the person has this disease is that they have to come in and get tested, and if we don't do this, like, oh my goodness, the whole country could end up getting whatever this disease is. If they made a law that required everyone from that country to come and get a blood test to see if they had that disease, it would pass. Because how else are you going to do it, right? Like, it's super important because we don't want people to die from this disease. And like, these people are the only people that have the disease, and the only way I'm going to know and stop the transmission of the disease is to like get people blood tested. That would probably work, because like it's a super good reason. It's for health and make sure that people don't die. And
the law is only about those people, right?
It's not like superly overbroad. It's not superly under-inclusive. Like, it makes sense.
Narrowly tailored just to those people, and it's addressing a really big problem.
Necessary has to be.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And it was like the one where when Pearl Harbor was bombed.
Yes, so you know about Korematsu versus United States, which is a real anomaly. That case called Korematsu versus United States is the only case in American history that's ever passed strict scrutiny for a non-affirmative action case. So they took all of the people that were Japanese, and they made them stay in like a camp in California.
American citizens or
American citizens, like whatever. They were just like, sorry, you might be the enemy. And it was like super harsh. Like, it was a crazy thing for them to have done. But because the country was at war at the time, the Supreme Court said, you know what? Not knowing who is our enemy at war, that is a compelling state interest. And we believe that this was the only way America could have protected itself. I guarantee that that wouldn't fly now, because there's no way that the Supreme Court would actually believe that that's necessary to do it now. But at the time, the court, it was the 40s, right? So at the time, the court was like, all right, it's wartime. We're going to kind of like be very generous.
They're trying to do it now. They're trying to do sneaky things now with Muslims. They're trying to watch Muslims. They're trying to pass some policies. So if I was going to think about a law that my professor might put on the final exam that might be tested using strict scrutiny, I would think about what's going on with Muslims right now.
Yeah, and I would think about like that the compelling interest is always going to be preventing terrorism, but the problem is often that this law isn't absolutely necessary. Like, there's better ways. There could be better ways to do it than this law. So like, and you'll read a whole bunch of race-based classification laws, older laws, that they're almost always about blacks and whites. They almost universally are from the South, and they almost universally are like doing just, I'm trying to remember what the laws did. They like always disadvantaged blacks in some way that was like really ridiculous and annoying.
There was the gerrymandering cases where
there's the voting cases, the blacks can't vote, and the blacks can't be on a jury, and they can't marry people.
Certain districts so that the blacks in that district had a very unequal voting results. There's grandfather
right. There's all of those.
There's
all of those
segregation cases.
Right. So you have those, and every time it goes through the same formula to figure out if it's okay. It's always like, what's the reason why you had this law? State, tell us your reason. And the state is supposed to come up with some very important reason. And then, was this law necessary to achieving that objective? And the court will look and say, maybe it isn't, maybe it isn't. In some cases, the court said it was all right. In some cases, the court said it wasn't okay. Most of the race-based classifications get struck down, though. Quasi-suspect class is when you have, mostly they're gender cases. Sometimes they're legitimacy cases. That gets intermediate scrutiny, which is almost as difficult to pass.
In that one, it doesn't have to be the only way to solve the problem.
But it has to be a good way.
It has to be a good reason.
It has to be an important state interest.
Right. But it doesn't have to be the only way to solve the problem.
It has to be narrowly tailored. It's almost the same thing as strict scrutiny. It's just not quite as strict. And here's why. It totally makes sense, right? If you think about it, how often does it matter what your race is for purposes of knowing like what you can do and not do? Not real often. Like, I guess there could be something if it was like a physical health thing. I can't really think, it's very difficult to articulate a situation where like, I could tell you right off the bat that if all I knew is that this person's black and that person's white, that it would tell me the answer to whatever the question is. Like, usually it's not really all that relevant what someone's race is. What someone's gender is similarly not usually relevant, but it's relevant sometimes. Because realistically, men and women are different. So like, sometimes it's relevant. I mean, if there's a law that requires everyone to have a gynecological exam, that doesn't really make a lot of sense for men, right? Like, it's just, sometimes it's just different, like, and it's not about what I think women can do and what I think men can do. Like, sometimes they're just different at the end. If there's a law about pregnancy, it's not really going to affect men.
Is this kind of like what's in the news now with the abortion thing? I think it's in Virginia where the senator is trying to mandate
Yes.
that women have.
Okay, yes and no.
Okay.
Yeah, try to mandate that women, what is it that they have to,
Ultrasound?
that they have, oh, right, that they have a special, that have the
And they
transvaginal
look at the-
ultrasound
right, look at the
before,
picture before having
right.
the abortion.
It is not equal protection,
Okay.
because the law, even though it clearly obviously only applies to women,
Mhm.
the problem is not that the women have to do this, but that other people don't have to do it. The problem with that is a due process problem.
Okay.
Okay, the abortion
about
cases
individual
come under
rights.
individual rights,
Right, okay.
and it's under everyone gets the right to privacy, and it's interfering too much with the right to privacy.
Okay.
But it is all sort of intertwined, absolutely. So the cases that like make women do some things and make men do other things, they have to withstand also a pretty difficult kind of scrutiny where the state has to prove that they have a pretty important reason and that this was pretty narrowly tailored. It doesn't have to be the only way, but it has to be a very good way of them accomplishing what their goal was.
So we're gonna stop breast cancer. Okay,
Mhm.
so.
like, that's
we
a great
have-
goal,
It's a
obviously.
great goal, and so there's gonna be mandatory mammograms for everyone over 35, and that's gonna be the new rule, okay?
That'll probably work, but the
Now,
same
there's
thing.
also sonograms, right? So, and the reason why we have this test is because we want to stop breast cancer, right? So it doesn't have to be the only way, but it's a good way, and it's solving the problem, so that's good. You understand?
But if they made it, and if they made it,
the only way.
if they took the same law, everyone has to get mammograms, but it wasn't women over 35, it was all women above 15. Probably that's like a little too much, so probably like that wouldn't stand, even though the goal is a good goal. Does that make sense? Okay, the last one is everybody else, that's the non-suspect class. They have a very low standard, okay? They only have to survive a rational basis. And that test is rationally related to a legitimate state interest. It doesn't have to be a super important thing that they're trying to accomplish. It just has to be anything that's not bad. Anything. It could be any legitimate, anything. Anything that's not trying to purposely hurt people.
I'm just gonna go and check on our.
Yep. And then we're gonna get started with our writing soon. Anything that's not hurting people. And like, it doesn't even have to be a really good way. It just has to be a way that could accomplish that. It doesn't have to be the best way. It just has to like make some sense that this law is gonna somehow, it has to be like not total BS, basically. And what you have when you have the non-suspect class cases are, you know, things where they treat children different from adults, right? Because there's a great reason to treat children different from adults. And that, but yet it's still breaking people up into classes. They'll read a bunch of gay cases in those because there's been a lot of movement over many years to try to have homosexuals be treated at least as a quasi-suspect class, and the court has always said no, it's a non-suspect class, which is a really harsh sort of decision because then it means that laws that treat gays differently from straights, they basically only have to survive a really minimal scrutiny. So what that does is allows for laws to discriminate against gays. Not always, but sometimes it could allow for a little bit more discrimination. And historically, you'll read some cases to show what does it take to become a suspect class. Basically, you'll have to, you have to show a history of being discriminated against, which, and if you think about it, right, like, so that seems like that should fit with gays, right? History of being discriminated against. Where it goes wrong, not wrong, but where it goes off, is it has to be an immutable characteristic, something about yourself that you cannot change. Like you cannot change your race. Like it just is what it is. And there's a lot of debate about whether whether you're born being gay or not. And that's why actually that question can be very legally important. Because if it's something you cannot change, then it's actually, then that should be a strict scrutiny characteristic. If it's something that you can change, then it doesn't deserve to be a strict scrutiny characteristic. Yeah.
But then wouldn't that mean gender would have to move to strict scrutiny? Because you can't control gender, so then it couldn't be intermediate anymore. It would have
But
to-
not everything that you can't change. Like you can't change your eye color either. But that doesn't mean that blue-eyed people get intermediate scrutiny. And
No,
there
I guess my question is more like, so how could gay people move to strict scrutiny if women have a longer history of being discriminated?
it doesn't quite work like that.
Okay.
Okay, it doesn't. It's not like a contest, like who gets it. It's not like that. You're right. Like women could have easily could have gotten strict scrutiny because there is a history of discrimination and you can't change it. Sure, but the court declined to do that, and that's why they invented intermediate scrutiny. And the reason, if I had to guess, the reason why they invented intermediate scrutiny is because there is a fundamental difference between men and women, more so than there is a fundamental difference between blacks and whites. Like it makes more of a difference. You know what I'm saying? Like that there are not more of a difference, but there's more reasons that the law might want to treat women and men differently than there are reasons why the law should legitimately treat blacks and whites differently. So let's talk about what's going to be on your exam. I'm going to give you a question, and maybe we can write out the analysis. And these are the bare bones of the equal protection analysis. However, if you get this and you can hold on to this through your reading, you'll see everything falls into one of those things. Everything falls into one of those categories. So the court, when faced with an equal protection challenge to a state law, the court is always going to spend part of the analysis figuring out which scrutiny it gets. And the court spends the second part of the analysis actually applying that scrutiny and seeing if it passes, which is a two-step process. Is the reason compelling enough? Is the law tailored enough to that reason? Does that make sense? Okay. So let's think of a practice question, and then we can write like a little essay about it. All right, so we have a state law. It doesn't matter what it's called, state. And let's see. Let's see if I want to use one that really exists. There's a really big problem with childhood obesity. There's a big problem with childhood obesity. So one state is going to be proactive about it and make a law that says any child who has two parents, both of whom are morbidly obese, has to go to mandatory nutrition counseling. Because typically the research shows that two fat parents usually end up with fat kids. So this is the law to combat the major problem of childhood obesity. The state has made a law that says that children who have two parents that are both obese needs to go to mandatory nutrition counseling. Okay, now your job. Do you guys feel like you know enough about what the law is about to write that? Okay, take us through an essay, keeping in mind that the answer about which scrutiny this law gets is not necessarily clear, and the answer about whether it passes the scrutiny isn't necessarily clear. It's an on-the-fence kind of situation, okay? Take it from here.